To what extent were economic problems the main cause of political instability in France between 1790 and 1795? The period 1790–1795 witnessed extreme political instability in France, as the revolution moved from constitutional monarchy to radical republic, and then the Terror. While economic problems, particularly hyperinflation, food shortages, and war-related disruption, played a central role in fueling unrest and radicalization, they were not the sole cause. Political miscalculations, foreign war, and ideological divisions also contributed significantly. This essay argues that economic difficulties were the most important single cause of instability in this period, as they created the mass pressure from the sans-culottes that drove the revolution leftwards, but they interacted with and were worsened by political and military factors. Economic problems were severe and persistent from 1790 onwards, creating widespread hardship that undermined successive governments. The assignat, introduced in 1789 as paper currency backed by confiscated church lands, rapidly lost value. By 1793, overissuance had caused hyperinflation, with the assignat falling to less than 20% of its face value by 1795. Food prices soared. The price of bread in Paris rose from 14 sous in 1789 to over 60 sous by 1793. Poor harvests in 1780, 1789, and 1793, 1794 compounded the crisis, while wartime requisitioning of grain for the army left cities short of supplies. These hardships produced constant pressure from the urban poor, sans-culottes, who demanded price controls and radical action. The result was a cycle of unrest. Food riots in 1792, 1793, the September massacres, and the Journées of 1793 that forced the National Convention to adopt radical measures. Economic distress thus acted as the engine of political radicalization. The government's responses to these economic problems further destabilized the political situation. The National Convention introduced the maximum gain rule, May 1793, fixing prices on essential goods and enforced grain requisitions. While these policies temporarily eased shortages in Paris, they created new problems. Peasants hoarded grain or slaughtered livestock rather than sell at fixed prices, leading to the collapse of agricultural production and the devastating famine of 1793–1794, especially the Holodomor-like conditions in parts of the countryside. The enforcement of the maximum required a vast network of surveillance and coercion, which the Committee of Public Safety used to justify the terror. Thus, economic policy itself became a source of instability, as attempts to solve one crisis, inflation and hunger, created new ones, black markets, rural revolts, and the need for ever greater repression. However, economic problems did not operate in isolation. The outbreak of war with Austria and Prussia in April 1792 dramatically worsened the economic situation and provided the political justification for radical measures. War costs drained the treasury, increased assignat printing, and necessitated mass conscription. Levée en masse, August 1793, which provoked the Vendée Rebellion and Federalist revolts. Political divisions also played a major role. The struggle between Girondins and Jacobins in the Convention was not purely economic, but reflected differing visions of the revolution. The execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 and the purge of the Girondins in June 1793 were political acts that intensified instability, even though economic grievances provided the popular support for the Montagnards. Marxist historians, e.g., Sabel-Roudet, have emphasized the role of economic hardship in driving the sans-culottes and the radical phase, while revisionists, e.g., Furet, Doyle, argue that political and ideological factors were more decisive, with economic issues acting as a catalyst rather than the root cause. The consequences of this instability were profound. The economic crisis helped bring the Jacobins to power and justified the Reign of Terror, 1793, 1794, during which over 16,000 people were executed. The Thermidorian reaction, July 1794, ended the terror partly because the economic situation had stabilized somewhat after military victories reduced the need for extreme measures. However, the Directory, 1795-1799, inherited the same economic weaknesses, leading to continued instability until Napoleon's coup in 1799. Thus, while economic problems were central to the radicalization of 1792-1794, they were ultimately contained only by political violence and military success. In conclusion, economic problems were the most significant single cause of political instability in France between 1790 and 1795. Hyperinflation, food shortages, and the government's failed responses created the mass pressure that drove the revolution leftwards and justified the terror. However, these economic difficulties were amplified by the impact of war and deep political divisions among revolutionary factions. Without the economic grievances of the urban poor and peasants, the radical phase would have been far less intense. Economic factors therefore deserve to be seen as the primary driver of instability, though they cannot be separated from the political and military context of the revolution.